Sir William Seal.
Mr. Chairman, appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, can I remind you that this House has not had the benefit of having a select committee scrutinise this bill, and therefore we've been denied the opportunity of receiving the experience and advice from that particular committee. And so I'm going to go through clause by clause analysis of this bill, and we'll be asking questions of the government if they have any comments to explain what it is that they are doing to address the housing crisis. I draw your attention first, sir, to the explanatory note. I do so because the Minister challenged the validity of this bill. And in the explanatory note, we find this bill has two purposes. The first purpose is to require the government to increase its state housing stock of 1,000 units per year in any year that demand for state housing is not met, and that it be income-related rent. Secondly, it requires the government to make sufficient funding available to house those who are homeless and develop a plan to end homelessness. That's what this bill is about, and I believe, sir, it meets the primary purpose of the main bill that was introduced by the government. We look to Clause 11, which is common sense and refers to the Principal Act that we're amending. We look to Clause 12 and an introduction of a new section, 72A, income-related rent places. And there it talks about the corporation to increase its supply of Housing New Zealand housing by 1,000 per year. So there is a real need for that. My own experience, sir, where we see people sleeping in cars, overcrowded housing conditions, in garages, requires the government to build more social housing. The word income-related rent, sir, is important because in our engagement with budgeting services, with community organisations at the coalface, they tell us that once upon a time, people renting from Housing New Zealand used to spend 25% or 30% of their income in rental from Housing New Zealand. Today, it is 65%. This is revealed to me by budgeting services in Auckland, in Nelson, in Gisborne. So I'm not saying that this does not exist. This does exist. We go to Part 8A, new Part A, Emergency Housing and Homeless. And we see in Clause 98A the interpretation of terms used in this part. We look at homeless, and it refers that the situation where a person meets the definition of homelessness set out in Statistics New Zealand's definition. We find, sir, that that definition says that when somebody has no other option to acquire for safe, secure housing, it makes reference to people living in conditions without shelter. I suspect, sir, that these are people, like in the situation in Auckland, living under bridges, next to grave sites. There is no shelter, under trees. It makes reference, sir, to people living in temporary accommodation, which are not their own. It makes reference to sharing accommodation. Let me go back to temporary accommodation. I suspect, sir, that people living in garages consider that a temporary accommodation. The definition by New Zealand Statistics says that that is classed as being homeless. Yet we have had Housing New Zealand, or WINS was it, that referred people to living in a garage and said that that would be appropriate accommodation. Yet in the definition of the Statistics Department, it says no. We have people sharing accommodation. We have people living in uninhabitable housing. So this is people living in debilitated situations. I can't imagine that here in New Zealand that this government allows people to live in these conditions. I refer again, sir, to the homeless definition by Statistics New Zealand, where it says, where people have no other option to acquire for safe, secure housing. I refer to Clause 98B. The joint ministers must ensure sufficient places for emergency housing. So that makes sense. This government has 3 ministers, all with housing portfolio. 3 ministers. Every other government has had only 1 minister. And Mr. Chairman,
Ken Wilson, sing back.